Hello?
Hey, the account is now live. I'm just going to tweet out a link for those who would like to follow along in real time. But like I said, it'll be available for eternity regardless. So just let me do that quickly. And then I don't know if you have your phone or whatever, but you can retweet it or not once I send out the link. The only issue is on my my laptop. Twitter gets a little slow once I have the when I have the Hangout going simultaneously, so it takes a little bit longer.
Close my door. That didn't work. Fix it later. You got a link?
Do I have a mic? No, it's just the computer.
No, I said you have a link.
Oh yeah, I'm just composing the tweet right now.
Okay. Yeah, the gun is probably a good thing.
Okay, it's sent out. And I guess some people will trickle in now. It's sort of an awkward time to do the live chat, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, so I guess just you had the Medium thing came out. Oh, maybe like was it yesterday? So maybe just briefly summarize what has caused you to formulate this theory as to the divide supposedly. That's an indicator of how the election season has proceeded. What information did you gather that caused you to formulate that thesis?
Basically, I would say 5 years of driving around the United States, and that's equivalent to about 250,000 miles I put on my car. And the bulk of that in the last 2 years, going to places that are not places I generally went before prior to this, except in my childhood. And that's parts of, I guess, what people derogatorily call the flyover country. And I was doing that under the auspices of studying addiction and documenting addiction. And so it was going to places that were poor and were left behind. And I started getting this sense that then I returned home, and I had lived in Brooklyn at the time, and now I live upstate New York. But I was getting the sense that I was seeing basically two Americas, whatever term you want to say, and I was trying to grapple with what was a unifying feature of the two different, what was different about the two Americas. And there was a lot of, obvious differences in terms of wealth, in terms of geography. But ultimately what it really came down to was, in my mind, was education. Kind of the places I saw that were suffering the most in terms of addiction, in terms of just feeling very, very, very distant from the urban centers, were places that just people didn't have a lot of education, or there weren't major institutions nearby. So you could go to a small town like Princeton, and that was very different than going to a small town like Danville, Vermont, Virginia, because Danville, Virginia doesn't have a big college. And I started thinking that what kind of divides us, and we're very divided, is kind of defined by education. There are those of us who have postgraduate degrees, like myself, professionals. I got a PhD. And then there are those who, barely finish high school, maybe get some college, primarily at a community college, and there are places where that's the bulk of the people. And I think.
And you say there are no institutions in some of those places. So you've written for the Guardian dispatches from areas of the country where pundits don't typically travel because they're not destinations, so to say.
Correct.
So like Eastern Kentucky was one representative dispatch, and there you kind of laid out this theory that you have, when institutions are nowhere to be found. So when there's no kind of communal, when there's no institution around which communal activity can be fostered, people gravitate toward basically. People create their own new institutions out of these totems of kind of modern day capitalism. I don't want to be pedantic about it, but people will gather at the Walmart or they'll gather at the McDonald's.
That's right.
That's all that's available to them in these places, and that's the kind of And if somebody in Brooklyn Heights were to be told that people are gathering at a McDonald's or a Walmart, that would seem maybe worth scoffing at to some of them, or at very least it wouldn't seem intuitive. So how do these people in these places that you've been to, and I guess we should just stipulate that you and I a couple days ago went to Lewiston, Maine together,
we went to Lewiston, Maine for a weekend trip.
Yeah, which could be one of these heartland type areas, although it's not technically in the flyover zone because you don't fly over Maine to get anywhere really.
But it has a lot of the same. It does have a premier institution. It has what was it called? Has one of the colleges.
Bates College.
Bates. But it's an old mill town that's lost its mills. And what many of the towns I go to or places they've lost jobs. The Rust Belt, upstate New York, the Appalachian region, they've lost industry, and the industry has gone elsewhere. Milwaukee, I was just in, and these places have lost. Institutions, and primarily institutions being jobs. And a lot of people, I always say that, we the front row kids, as I call us, we define ourselves through our jobs. That's what gives us meaning. That's what gives us value. People who, are in the back row for searching for a different word, they define themselves through things not their jobs. Beyond their jobs, because their jobs aren't really things that they value or that value them. It used to be a union work gave you a community and gave you value in the community, but when the unions died and the jobs that people worked in these places left, you don't get the same value out of working at a Walmart. You just don't. And a lot of people would tell me, and there's a guy in Prestonburg, Kentucky, who we'd smoke outside. He stocked the shelves in Walmart at night, and I would hang out with him, at the table out in front of Walmart, and he would just say, it pays the bills. Like, what do you think about your job? It pays the bills. It's just a very utilitarian. It gives me money to get by, and so there's a sense in many of these places that people are looking for meaning beyond work, and that's generally been institutions, church, bowling leagues, things like that, and many of those are gone as well. One of the fascinating anecdotes that we came across on our Lewiston trip was this phenomenon of the social clubs in town. Right, so even compared to other parts of Maine, the culture of the social club in Lewiston, in particular, and Auburn, which is sort of its sister city, is distinct. And they were saying that with the disintegration of the mill industry, commensurately you saw the disintegration of the social clubs as the center of the cultural life of the city. Now they're still around in sort of a remnant form, but they don't have nearly as much vitality. So that leads to people being atomized, where they don't gather, they don't have as much impetus to forge communal bonds anymore. And that has all kinds of consequences sociologically and politically and so on. Yeah, I mean those social clubs were fascinating. We drank at the one called the Acme Snowshoe Club, which was organized around snowshoe racing. But as the owner told us, it basically served as a living room for workers back in the 70s and 60s who had come down from Canada, who immigrated down.
Yeah, so this is a largely Franco-American, or there's a big population of Franco-Americans or Franco-American descendants in this area of
yeah, and it was fascinating is because they would he said it was their living room because a lot of these guys didn't have a lot of money but they worked the mills, and then they would come to the club and take a shower downstairs because he said they had showers down there. And then they'd come up and hang out in the club. A lot of those institutions are gone now. The mills are gone, but then you get into the very hairy issue of that kind of sense of community was changed when they brought in Somali refugees. And Lewiston is a unique case in that way because what's also going on is a lot of clashes between the Somali refugees and not clashes. I would say is a lot of disruption in the minds of those who were there before, about kind of like my town is gone, and it's hard to untangle for them. Was it the Somali refugees that their town is gone, or is it because the mills are gone? Yeah,
so, and just one thing is that we often hear that there's almost a sense of exasperation on the part of certain elements of the commentariat about this overemphasis on manufacturing and how it's left. But one thing that this, being in that social club really drove home to me is that we're only really relatively at the beginning of the post-industrial era in places like Lewiston, because according to the proprietor of the social club, the gentleman we spoke to, who was, I don't know what it is, mid to late 60s or something, but he said that the last mill in town closed just 15 years ago. That's not that long ago in terms of the sweep of time. And they would have to double check the factual veracity of that claim, but I think he seems to be a pretty keen decipherer of local trends, so I'm being inclined to trust his his comment on that. So it's even though some pundits are kind of fed up with dwelling on the flight of manufacturing industry, it really hasn't been all that long, 15 years since, in this case, since it was the lifeblood of the local economy.
I mean, a lot of them started leaving late 70s, but the bulk of it took place in the 80s and 90s. But yeah, I mean, every community I've been in has dramatically changed and has been hollowed out in many ways. The economic base has been hollowed out by companies leaving, but also the institutional Walmarts now are at the edge of every town and dominate the environment of the town. That's killed the city centers. The city centers are gone in terms of having any institutions beyond civic. So you go downtown to a town that used to have things downtown. Now all it has is rehab clinics and courthouses. And you see a few bespoke companies popping up that try to rejuvenate the downtown, but the bulk of the energy is found in the franchises on the edge of town, the McDonald's, the Walmarts. That's where a lot of life takes place. And I think that whole, it's not something that a lot of people love to talk about because it's hard to document. It's hard to write, statistics about it. But there is, in all these towns, there's a sense that they've been kind of hollowed out, and people have had to rebuild networks and build meaning in this environment that's kind of deadening. McDonald's, Walmart's. I mean, it happens. They do it. They form vibrant social networks, but it's all kind of sad in a way. And I think what also is very, very demanding, which changes the dynamics a lot, is a lot of people do not like that their town has been given over to taking handouts. There's a sense of immense embarrassment that comes with being on subsistence, state subsistence, and that just doesn't that's not just people who are doing it themselves, but it's the whole community is relatively embarrassed, and there's a real sense of hurt pride and humiliation that I think fuels a lot of the anger you see now.
And they tend to channel that. It's hard to generalize about this, but many of them would seem to channel that humiliation and that anger inward. So they'll blame either themselves or their neighbors or people that they see on the street, or they'll even scapegoat sometimes, say, minorities in the area for the reason why they're now dependent on government subsistence. So they're.
I think there's a lot of scapegoating going on. I think more than I think that's what Trump is playing on. I think there's always. I mean, this is all entangled with racism, and I don't want to not talk about that, because it's. I mean, a lot of these places are, you see this sort of thing has been going on in poor black neighborhoods for a long time. They've been hollowed out for blank many years by institutional racism. So they've been fighting the same sense of kind of, African American communities in Detroit and Milwaukee, poor communities have been fighting this demand for respect, this sense of being kind of left behind for 40, 50 years, far more, institutionally before that. So what's kind of going on with white working class has been going on, for eons with black working class. Because we just basically we're segregated. And so some of what's going on in these white working class communities is certainly anger at having been devalued relative to the black working class. The black are giving a lot more rights recently, which is fantastic. And so it's hard to untangle what of this is, what of the anger in the white working class is just outright racism, and what's directed at the kind of economic problems. And it's in my mind, it's intertwined. You can't separate the two.
Yeah, what's unique about Trump, and we'll have to, inevitably segue into Trump to some extent now, because it's always the elephant in the room. But what's unique about Trump, or one of the things that is unique about Trump, is that he does obviously play on this scapegoating instinct that a lot of people in these deprived communities would probably kind of naturally take upon themselves anyway. But he's coupling that with an anti-globalism, anti-free trade, pro-American nationalistic policy that you wouldn't see from a typical Republican nominee, who nevertheless might also try to play on the same scapegoating tactic. So Romney might have played on some of that, but he wouldn't have coupled it with the anti-NAFTA rhetoric and the anti-TPP rhetoric.
The anti-immigration thing, the anti-globalization, the anti-free trade, the anti-immigration is a 1-2 punch. It's perfect in that communities because it attacks the salient economic issues they view. Their companies have left, and they've left because they've moved because of NAFTA, free trade. Whether that is factually true or not is immaterial. To them, it's true. They've seen the company leave.
And there's ample factual basis for at least that inclination of doing that, right?
It's certainly less clear cut to me than it is to them. But then again, I'm not living in their cities, and I'm not having their friend lose a job because their company's moved overseas. I mean, it's free trade has given them benefits that are harder to see than what the losses they face. So there's a lot. So the anti-immigration, anti-globalization is a 1-2 punch because it plays both into the real economic anxiety and is probably a fair reason for them to be angry, and then it plays into the scapegoating. It's like, well, the Mexicans have taken our jobs, or the blacks, or the Muslims, or the sense of other, and you always blame the other. And this is something I've seen consistently in the Republican base. Is there's always been a disconnect between leadership and the Republican base on the issue of free trade and immigration, and that was in many ways that's really Trump's trump card.
So, one of the one thing, I'll grant, and obviously I think it's undeniably true that there is a lot of scapegoating the other, so to say. But there's been research that came out, I recall, in the aftermath of the 2014 midterm elections, which showed that in many of these areas there's in equal measure a tendency to blame members of the fellow sociological cohort, or demographic cohort. So, in other words, people who are white working class will also heap scorn on fellow members of the white working class for being excessively dependent on government assistance or that kind of thing. And I think that kind of stems from this atomization and this loss of communal bonds, that they are kind of much more willing than previously to otherize, quote unquote, even people who are racially and socioeconomically similar to them.
Well, I mean, I certainly believe that when people, it goes back to the old writings of Durkheim, who basically invented sociology, where he talked about the enemy, the sense of you need to feel a sense of belonging. You need to belong. People need to belong to something larger than, and a lot of what people used to belong to, they need to be members of a club that values them. And in the grand scheme of things, the United States they're no longer in the in club. They used to be in the in club 40 years ago. They're no longer in the in club. The in club is the front row kids, and the out club is the back row kids. And when you're not in the in club, a lot of things go on. There's a desire to be back in the in club. There's revenge. There's you become more conducive to scapegoating. There's a lot more social deviance pops up. It's drugs and all these things. Ultimately, it's this sense of feeling left behind and feeling humiliated. That's just racism. Racism is a scam that sells to people who want quick meaning, quick identity. It's very easy. Hey, look, you're white. You're better than everybody else. Go for it. And it really, and it plays on. If you didn't, in my opinion, you're always going to have racism. It's always going to be a segment of the population that's just core racist. That's bad. But if you set up a culture that's very divided, the out group's going to be prone to these things a lot more than the in group. And the out group these days is the back row kids.
Yeah, and this kind of leads into a recurring theme that you've raised at various points with certain liberal commentators who shall go unnamed. But there's a strain in the liberal punditocracy right now, and there has been for some time, in terms of analyzing Trump support, or Trump supporters, which is now sort of an anthropological construct in their minds. So these liberal commentators will bristle at the notion that any kind of economic explanation for their behavior is descriptively tenable.
Well,
and they will say that that's unduly emphasized at the expense of just identifying their plain old-fashioned racism, which is much more animating in terms of why they support Trump. And I think it's useful to limit this. Now, because first of all, there are probably around 60 million people that are going to end up voting for Trump, whether he wins or loses. So for purpose of this of argument, I mean, I think it's useful to limit this discussion to a segment of Trump supporters who dwell in the types of areas of the country that we've just been talking about. So, what would, if you had to distill it, what do the people who kind of express this line of criticism miss?
They miss that. There's so much they miss, but ultimately, I think they're doing what it's often they'll just say, well, these voters are dumb or they're racist, and that's exactly what they rightfully push back on conservative commentators who look at inner cities and say, well, the crime is high, blacks are just violent.
That's a good point. Just to interject real quickly, I mean, there's been a long-standing conservative trope that there's something inherently criminogenic about blacks, especially in inner cities.
Yeah.
So and that culture is the fundamental explanation for why crime tends to be prevalent in those areas. So this is kind of the liberal mirror image of that.
But that's exactly right. And so it's like, it's the, they wear baggy jeans and they listen to hip hop music. Of course they're violent. They go to NASCAR and they eat at McDonald's. Of course they're racist. And it's what I always say, and I push back against a lot of people. And you can name them. I mean, it's like who's to say it's all racism? That's kind of that's elitism. To simply not, we liberals, and I count myself as a liberal, we're supposed to give every problem context, socioeconomic context, and yet we don't do that with racism or nationalism. We don't look at the context behind that. Now, you say, so what? What's wrong? Racism is bad regardless of if you give context. Yes, I agree, racism is bad regardless of the context. It's if you want to solve it, if you want to address it, you need to understand the context that's there. And in that sense, I feel very much like, so first of all, they miss the context, but it's very convenient to miss the context because what I am blaming is neoliberalism. I'm blaming the kind of the marketization of human beings, the putting the market in every aspect of their life, making every decision based on maximizing your revenue or your GDP, thinking that everybody is solely driven by economics and not driven by social issues. When you make decisions, policy decisions, saying that the sole goal is to increase the economy, increase the growth, increase the GDP, you make decisions like NAFTA, which looks good on paper, but has tertiary and secondary effects that destroy social groups. And so in my mind, that's what you're seeing, is you're saying, oh, look, free trade, it's great. Free trade on paper works because the winners win more than the loser lose, so net, it's a positive. But you don't look at the secondary First of all, the winners never give to the losers, so that's called, the winners are supposed to help the losers, they haven't. So that calls it an economic divide, a growing divide, which is fueling discontent as well. But also the losers are losing more than just economically, they're losing socially. All their institutions are failing. Their sense of belonging is failing. And that's making them mad, rightfully mad. It's making them depressed, it's making them humiliated. And there's not a lot of honor these days in being in a poor community. Mm-hmm. Just working class white stuff. There's not a lot of honor.
And you said that they are rightfully indignant about these trends. And you, in response to that, what you'll frequently hear from a typical liberal commentator is, well, they're channeling that improperly by supporting Trump. And I say, okay, let's grant that is true. I mean, would their anger be channeled properly by supporting Hillary? So that, well, what's the logical corollary of that objection? I mean, I don't see how. So maybe supporting Trump, and there are gradations in support of Trump. Like, some of them are rabid and would go to a rally and actively advocate for Trump, and some of them might just roll out of bed on November 8th and just go cast their vote without doing anything further. But it doesn't seem to follow to me that supporting Hillary would somehow be a
I lost you.
What do you think?
I lost you there for a second.
Oh, you couldn't hear me?
No, I couldn't. So just repeat your question real quickly.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think one common refrain that you'll hear from a prototypical liberal commentator is that they'll concede that Trump supporters do have some legitimate grievances, right? But they'll say that they are channeling the energy that derives from those grievances improperly by supporting Trump. To which I will respond, okay, let's grant that as true. Would it be somehow then proper to channel their grievances into support of Hillary? Like, I just don't see how that follows from the premise.
Again, I think they have very different decisions. You always have to look at people's decisions within the context of where they are, you know. And the decision to vote for Trump, I think, is twofold. Threefold. I think it's one of us anti-globalization. Four, anti-globalization. There's the racial white identity. Anti-globalization is also throwing spitballs at the front row kids, is saying, you know, basically, fuck you. Don't tell me what to do. You've been telling me what to do for so long. And I think the fourth is, I think you have to look at how people value. I think what I said is, the front row and the back row have very different value systems, in the sense that how they define meaning is differently. The back row defines meaning through local institutions, through the community. In Trump, they see, I don't see it, but they see it, somebody who, in their mind, values their institutions, values their communities, will restore their communities. But as opposed to Hillary, who has a front row agenda that has a very different set of beliefs relative to people in Kentucky or relative to people in, you know, the guys we met in Lewiston. They have a very different there's a very different value structure, and some of that is racial, and some of that is multicultural, and but it's more about, I value the local. I value what's around me. I don't value the global. I don't, you know, that's just not how I see things.
Yeah, and you know, when you say that there is a racial dimension to what those guys in Lewiston were expressing to us, I think that is true, but it's not consciously racial. So here's a fallacy in the way liberals will analyze Trump supporters. They will conflate the minority of people who do have a consciously racial outlook, so the ideological racists or white nationalists, some of whom have glommed onto Trump. They'll conflate them with the people like the guys in Lewiston who might have some subconscious racial dimension to their outlook, but I don't think would have a common affinity with these white nationalist types at all. It just seems like an unwarranted conflation.
I think there's racism racism is very nuanced, but it's everywhere. And there's a racism that takes place in Kentucky, and there's a racism that takes place in New York City. And how racism plays out is often it's the ugly side of it is often forced to be played out with the working class, because they're the ones who have to deal with it on a very physical, visceral level. They, you know, I can give you the way unions, you know, you look at, I was just in Milwaukee in the black neighborhood there. I spent a week writing about the black neighborhood in Milwaukee, and the way factory owners played the race card so whenever the unions were all white in the 30s and 40s, and when blacks started work, or they wouldn't let blacks work, the unions, the factory owners, and when there would be strikes, they would import black labor and use them as strike breakers. So right there, just simply setting up a perfect, you know, just using race and racism, using race to stroke racism. And I think that goes on a lot at the working class level, where you get a lot of people, it's much more physical and visceral form of having to deal with issues, whereas it's very easy to say I'm not a racist when you live in Brooklyn Heights and, you know, you don't face the same struggles that somebody faces in a working class community. So how it plays out is you know, is much different and much more aggressively than in wealthy neighborhoods, which are just as racist.
Yeah, but the wealthy people can afford to transmute their racism, so to say, a little more in less outwardly offensive ways.
Exactly.
So they'll do it more.
That's a nice way of putting it. Yes.
So they'll do it more surreptitiously, and they'll dress it up in kind of polite language. Whereas in the working class, they don't have the, I don't want to say cognitive resources, but
they don't have the PR departments.
Yeah, they don't have a PR department. They don't have, you know, Lena Dunham telling them which hashtag to use. So they don't have like the framework from which to properly signal their racial anxieties, and it often comes out in crude
Well,
ways verbally.
what I say, regardless of Trump, prior to that, we live segregated lives. You know, when I was in Cleveland during the GOP convention, I never went downtown. Instead, I spent half my time in Central in the Althwaite projects, which is one of America's first housing projects, all black. And then I spent the other half in Parma, which is a working class white neighborhood, which is almost all white. And the point I was trying to make is how we live is racial. How we segregate ourselves, or let me rephrase that. We put minorities, we force segregation on minorities. So we live our lives basically in segregated manners, and then we're surprised that our politics are also segregated, or also play out around racial lines.
Yeah, and you know, it's most blatant.
The racism, what's the racism that is occurring in the Trump campaign is a manifestation of the racism and housing policy that exists, the structural racism in the U.S. That's not me saying, hey, it's bad. It's not bad. It's bad. It's awful. But
yeah, and
Trump is taking advantage of pre-existing condition.
Right, and you know that racial stratification, I think, is most manifest and most egregious historically when it comes to just pure white versus black stratification, whether it comes to housing or educational opportunity or law enforcement, etc. But even in this, even in Lewiston, Maine, it seems like, you know, it reminded me that even among whites there is a stratification among ethnicity, or historically there has been, just because many of these social clubs were organized around ethnic backgrounds. So even in Lewiston, Maine, there was an Italian club, there was an Irish club, there was a French club, and so forth. So it's not as if there really is a profound legacy of this in all aspects of American life.
One of the things I wrote about in my piece on Cleveland was, if you are a working class white and you're looking for meaning, looking for some form of finding identity, racial identity is a no-go because of the historical consequences of that, because of our nation's structural racism. You can't get together with a bunch of guys and celebrate and say, hey, we're going to find identity through race. That's a no-go.
It's more ethnicity, right? So like Irish American Day. And
right, you're allowed to do that, but you're not allowed to, and consequently, these people kind of...
Like I grew up in North Jersey, right? And there were a lot of proud Italian Americans, I can tell you.
Right. So it kind of, you know, it leaves a lot of people kind of without, you know, and Trump, and what I saw in Cleveland was Trump has really basically said, okay, be proud. You're allowed to be proud now. But going back away from the racial angle for a bit, I think, because that's a very dangerous territory to talk on, because it's very sensitive, rightfully so. I think in terms of, I think going back to what pundits don't get, they don't get that some of this anger is justified. They don't get that the justification for that anger lays at their feet, at the kind of the globalized policies that they've encouraged, the deregulation of the banks, the NAFTA, TARP. I call them the acronyms, NAFTA and TARP. Two things that I feel, I always say that the bailout of the banks is kind of the anvil that broke the camel's back.
And you got to add TPP now, right, to the acronym.
Right, the continued,
the basket of acronyms.
Yes, the sense of you're pursuing these policies that are great for you, are based in your worldview, that fuck me. And with TARP, NAFTA was set the stage for feeling like, well, now our companies are gone great. TARP set the stage for, okay, now when you screw up, you bail yourselves out. I've heard multiple times variations of, well, that's great. You know, why didn't they bail us out when our factories left?
And you know, ironically enough, that was the main slogan of the Occupy Wall Street movement, at least in New York City. It was banks got bailed out, we got sold out. There's nothing inherently left-wing necessarily about that view, which is why you had even some conservatives and libertarians latch onto it. But you could see, but it's transferable to many different
I think
societal segments.
When the banks, when the Tea Party started and that sort of thing started, that was a sense of, well, the system's rigged. The system's rigged. And that really increased the anger another magnitude higher, and to the point now where you got the sense that you're destroying our communities, then coupled with, oh, now you're bailing yourselves out. That kind of just was a 1-2 punch that left many of these places just saying, well, damn it, I'll bet on a madman. I'll bet on a crazy guy. A guy coming, the monorail salesman who comes into town and says, I'm going to make everything great again.
And, one reason why I think blame must be laid at the feet of many of these elite pundit types is because, one thing that they've done, that they did in basically discounting the Bernie Sanders candidacy, is they said, oh, it's wrong and it's even pernicious to instill this notion that the system is rigged, or that the Democratic primary process was rigged, or that there is this sort of amorphous unfairness in the political order that is the fault of people now running the political system, who are these political elites and their media allies. So in declining to accept that premise, they've ceded territory to Trump, who can come in and say, oh, the stuff is rigged, and I'm the only one who can handle it. And in a sense, he's not correct in his prescriptions necessarily, but he's correct in that he's the only one full-throatedly trying to give credence to this widespread sense that there is a rigging going on, whether it's in the financial system, the political system, the criminal justice system, sports. I mean, go down the list. There's this.
I mean, look, before doing this, I was a banker for 20 years on Wall Street. It is rigged. I mean, it is rigged. The system is rigged. As I always say, the wealthy make mistakes, the poor go to jail. And
in New York City, they got stopped and frisked for the longest time, while the bankers got away with it.
The bailouts was an example of it being rigged. And so the front row kids bailed themselves out with TARP. Mistake number one. And the front row kids, the GOP, primarily, the neoconservatives, they pulled off the Iraq War. And the front row kids put in place a war that was fought by the back row kids. And there was those two, the Iraq War and TARP, were very much the sense of like, okay, we're being used. That just set this sense of, and you go to these places and there's just again, I can't. The only thing I keep on coming back to is humiliation and a desire for pride. In my Prestonburg piece on Prestonburg, Kentucky is 3,000 people. Old coal town. And I spent most of my time in the Walmart Plaza on the outside square. That's where so much of the town operates. And there was this kid sitting on his truck. He had a big truck. I have a picture in my piece. Forget his name. He was in the truck, and he only had one leg. He had he had a prosthetic limb. And he wasn't a military vet, and he had lost his leg as a kid, cancer. But affixed to the back of his truck was a big rebel flag. One of those guys who has the big pole with a Confederate flag. And I started asking him about his life a little bit. He was out front waiting for his girlfriend, his wife, to shop in Goodwill. And I said, what's up? What happened to you? He goes, well, I lost my leg when I was a kid. Because I was learning disabled too, and I dropped out of school when I was at 10, and in 10th grade because everybody used to call me retard. Everybody used to call me dumb, and cripple and dumb. And I said, oh, what's up with that flag? He goes, that represents me now. That's the thing I love, because that represents what I love, which is the South. I mean, it was him saying, it was like, for me, the perfect example of, here's someone who's been called dumb all his life, and he's finding identity through through Confederacy, through
And that guy, I mean, that guy's reason for
And I lost you again.
yeah, and that you lost me again. Can you hear me now? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Not sure if you can hear me.
Oh, now I can hear you again.
You can hear me again? Okay. Yeah, so that guy's reason for displaying the Confederate flag, as reprehensible as the icon is, his specific motivation probably wasn't principally any kind of racial resentment, right? It was something else related to his identity.
He wanted identity. He wanted to be part of something, and for him that meant, that was hunting and fishing and being a good old boy. And I didn't even ask him if he was going to vote for Trump, because I knew he was going to vote for Trump. I mean, I don't need to go there, and I don't need to make this silly conversation. But again, it's he kind of was like the cartoon character for me of so many people. They've been called dumb. They've been they've been made fun of, and in many of them, they feel like the front row kids have made fun of them, called them dumb all their lives. So when I read the Jonathan Chait piece, or Chait, or whatever it pronounces, Chait, saying
Chater's gonna Chait.
Trump voters are dumb. That that doesn't do anybody any good. That doesn't do any, except for Jonathan, except for him. It makes him feel better.
Except for it allows people in this elite cohort to flatter one another, right, and to preen about their moral superiority.
Right. So it's very frustrating because it's
which is funny. So like Chait will he'll assume that he's morally superior to that guy in the who had the Confederate flag, right? And maybe in the grand scheme of things, if you were able to tally up their virtue points, Chait will come out on top. But Chait, I mean, I don't want to fixate on Chait necessarily. It's just kind of arbitrary. But he's a guy who's, I mean, he agitated for the Iraq War in one of the nation's premier opinion journals, so he gave it intellectual credence. And that led to the deaths of scores of thousands of people, and we're even dealing with the ramifications right to this day. So is he really what makes him morally superior to that guy who had like no power and lost his leg and is just like hanging out at Walmart?
I mean, again, I think the biggest concern I have is not not so much whether it's right to judge, but strategically, whatever. But forget about all that, because those are really hard questions. But what about the strategy politically? If your goal is to really build a progressive, to move forward as a progressive party, and do we really want to be the party that creates, rigs the system, that that devalues whole segments of people because they didn't do so well in school? That isn't supposed to be to me. That's not what being a progressive is. Being a progressive is seeing the abilities of everybody and trying to have as equal a society as possible. That means treating the back row as equals of the front row in many ways, as opposed to just simply, we societies like to order themselves. We've ordered ourselves along education, which is okay, I guess, but we've really made the degree of ordering very rigid, not rigid, but very extreme. So we've given way too much compensation to the people at the top, economically and socially, and we've given way too little compensation to people at bottom, economically and socially. So that person who is in the Walmart parking lot, he's not only not gotten a lot economically, he's a social outcast. He's at the bottom socially, and we've got to, in my mind, we've got to be a society that is not as judgmental in terms of how we value people and how we reward them, both economically and socially. You're going to always reward some people more than others. That's fine. But the degree to which we do it, and the degree to which we relegate certain people and treat them as basically as on the outs is to me as a weakness of many of the front row kids, including the ones I agree with often.
Yeah, and I guess we'll wrap up shortly. But one point that I would make is that I think there can be a tendency of among people who maybe have a disposition similar to you and I toward these questions to assign excess blame to any individual elite. I don't think it's necessarily, although I think they deserve blame, as individuals, they aren't culpable for the system that has been erected around them, which walls them off from the life experiences of people who are in Prestonburg or Lewiston and who don't interact on a daily basis with magazine writers and think tank
But I,
sinecure holders.
but
So
I
I mean,
would I would even go a little. I mean, just walk out of your DC office and go into the black neighborhood and hang out there and live there.
yeah,
If you're in New York City, go to Hunts Point, where I spent 4 years documenting addiction. No, I mean, just don't go there on a Saturday to buy flowers. Go there and spend time there. I
or
mean,
even go to like Sheep's Head Bay or something where there are still plenty of white working class people around.
the degree to which we segregate ourselves is pretty amazing. Self-segregate ourselves, everybody.
Yeah. So and it takes conscious effort to break free of that. It's not something that could just like organically sprout up. You actually have to make special effort in order to facilitate for that for yourself. And the first step in facilitating those efforts is to acknowledge that there is some kind of problem that needs to be accounted for, or at least some kind of
Right.
disparity or gap.
And to beat a dead horse, a lot of people are in denial that there exists a valid problem. It's when you say, look, it's just racism, it's just stupidity. There's no solution there. That's just simply saying we're gonna ignore it and move on. And Trump is going to lose. We differ. Trump is going to lose very badly. And I'm happy with that. But the anger that is there, is the next guy that comes is just going to be a little bit less personally crazy than Trump and a little bit more cogent on his policy. And I think you're going to see a person come in with an anti-globalization policy that's mixed with racism, that's intertwined with racism, that's going to do very well for 2-3 years from now.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. I mean, I've never said that I believe Trump is going to win necessarily. I just feel like his odds are a little bit better than the consensus view, but that's neither here or there. He still may well lose. And either way, I think we're all kind of ready for this election to be over, although I can't deny that I do take some glee from it.
I'm just ready for it to be over.
That said, hopefully,
I don't want to write about Trump ever again.
okay, well, hopefully some people found this edifying. If not, sorry.
All right, thank you.
The losers and haters can never be fully appeased, but
right.
okay.
Bye.
Take care.